All right, perfect. Yeah, so my name is Sam Young. I'm the Important Plant Areas Program Manager at the California Native Plant Society State Office. My background is in environmental science, largely. Both my undergrad and graduate degrees were in that field. I've kind of worn a lot of different hats. I've worked doing botany surveys for the U.S. Forest Service. I've done private consulting. And I've done both international and local nonprofit work, most recently being the program manager for CNPS and mapping important plant areas. Tonight, what I'm going to do is talk to you about what important plant areas are, what some of the updates and kind of where we're at since the last time I had the privilege of speaking to all of you back in 2019. Back then, the only trial model we had completed was for the Central Valley. Now we have finished the entire California floristic province, Oregon to Mexico, and adjoining areas of the state in the desert outside of the floristic province. And I will preface, if you hear background noise, I have a talkative cat, so you might hear something in the background. So apologies in advance if you hear background noise. I will be going through all of these. I have quite a few slides. I'll be going through them somewhat quickly so that I can allow for time at the end for questions. But since I am kind of sharing my screen full screen, I probably won't see your comments or questions till we get to that period. That being said, I really want to thank Susan and Eddie for inviting me and wanting to hear the update. There is quite a bit to talk about. It's been an exciting couple of years for important plant areas, and especially as we are currently looking at moving towards the next phases of what CNPS will do with important plant areas. So with that, I think kind of just getting a background of like why we're mapping important plant areas and what they are. We're really talking about the conservation of biodiversity, which is the variability among living organisms. And this has lots of levels. You can talk about it within species, between species, and of ecosystems. So this is everything from genetic diversity to ecosystem assemblage. It has a lot of uses. You can talk about it, and I think large numbers of people really kind of see the intrinsic value of biodiversity. Life is valuable in and of the fact that it exists. However, there is a large amount of economic value humans derive as a species from quote unquote ecosystem services. This ranges from pollination, outdoor recreation, production of medicines, water cleaning, air cleaning, etc. Cultural values, human cultural practices are directly and indirectly tied to nature. And existential value. We are dependent as a species on the systems of life on this earth. And so you can kind of think about it as we're sitting on this big Jenga tower, and as we lose species, we're pulling blocks out of it, and it gets more and more wobbly the more and more we lose. So there's a lot of reasons to care about biodiversity. Despite how important this is, we are in the midst of a mass extinction event that is caused by our own activities. It's under threat at a global scale, with the scale of losses being forecast and being observed rivaling previous mass extinction events. And we know it's happening faster than previous mass extinction events, which is what the alarm is, on the scale of decades and centuries instead of millennia, and that human activities are causing it. So just to really zero in on California and the importance of biodiversity, it is a globally significant biodiversity hotspot. The California Floristic Province is recognized on the world stage as being significant. And that's because more than a quarter, as many as 30% of our 6,500 taxa are not found anywhere else in the world. So we've got a map of endemism here showing that number of taxa per 10,000 square kilometers, with the highest concentrations being in coastal California. I'm sure if you go to different regions of the state, they'll have different measures of biodiversity and this heat map might look different. But however you parse it out when you're looking at the continental or even the political boundaries of the United States, California is a hotspot. The center of the hotspot might vary a little bit depending on what metrics you look at, but that's kind of where IPAs come in. So the California Floristic Province is not just California. It extends from the Klamath Ranges in Oregon, where it's bounded in the north, largely due to substrate and geologic factors. The Klamath ultramafic block is full of like really cool serpentines and neat things like that kind of become less frequent when you get north of that little triangle there in southwestern Oregon. All the way to the south in Mediterranean Baja California, where really you're seeing kind of a gradual climatic shift. And depending on who you ask, that southern boundary will vary a little bit, and you might see different versions of that southern boundary on the map. But largely that's due to latitude and rainfall. To the west is the really obvious boundary of the ocean, and to the east is the Southern Cascades and Sierra Nevada and Peninsular Ranges spine, which kind of acts as this very significant geographic barrier separating California from the rest of the contiguous United States. So just to kind of go through like a visual tour, we've got everything from these beautiful redwood forests and lush ferns, kind of this temperate rainforest environment. This is Fern Canyon in Del Norte County. If you haven't been, this is pretty cool to walk through here. There's not so much a trail as you're wading through a sometimes dry riverbed with just like walls of greenery around you. To these lava fields from the Modoc Lava Beds National Monument, where it's definitely, you're kind of in this more sort of Great Basin environment, Northern Great Basin, but it is a transition environment. You're largely going to have open fields of basalt with scattered stands of juniper. The Trinity Alps is this really cool, and the associated Klamath region of California is this really cool ultramafic region with lots of very unique flora and geology happening. That's where we kind of have our very unique Darlingtonia cobra lilies that are really fun to photograph just because they look so strange. Pygmy forests in Mendocino County with kind of our stunted rhododendrons and our stands of bishop pine. Vernal pools throughout the Central Valley. This one is from I think the Mather Fields in Sacramento County, exhibited by fading rings of different colored wildflowers as the season goes on. Our own redwood forest, this is Muir Woods, that I'm sure everybody is very familiar with, very iconic. These kind of relict dinosaur forests that were once much more wide distributed and now kind of restricted to the northern coasts of California and southern Oregon. We have kind of these really neat transition zones. You look at the Bodie Hills, you get really high diversity because you do have a boundary of where the floristic province is spilling into the southern Great Basin. Here we have a nice wildflower show overlooking Mono Lake, which is also really, really great. And I think it will be good this year with all the rain that the desert has been getting in the snowpack. Carrizo Plain, amazing wildflower shows, probably one of the best intact native California grasslands and wildflower fields left. It's pretty incredible to go there. It's this island of San Joaquin Desert, which I formerly existed and still, some might argue, does exist along the western edge of the San Joaquin Valley and the bordering valleys adjacent to it to the west. But large portions of it have been lost to agricultural and other infrastructure development. Similarly, you got this kind of same wildflower shows in Tejon Ranch in Kern and Los Angeles counties. The Channel Islands, excellent places to see very, very endemic species, those kind of island endemics, lots of unique Dudleas and giant Coreopsis and cool things are out there. There's just a lot to explore in this whole state. Obviously, Joshua Tree kind of has these, I love, they kind of look like Dr. Seuss trees to me. And then we got these, even our California fan palms out in the desert. That's outside the floristic province, but still very unique features that are very limited in distribution. I think ultimately California is a pretty cool place. We have our neat looking Darlingtonia here that I put my sunglasses on up in up hiking around in Klamath National Forest. But with all of this, we have a large population with competing demands for natural resources. We have large demands for housing and needs to house our population. We have needs to grow food. We are one of the largest agricultural producers in the world, and there is high demands for that. And demands from energy, whether it be fossil fuel or renewable energy, meeting like our SB 100, getting to 100% renewables by 2045 or whatever it is. There's going to be a significant amount of development that's required to meet that goal. So what we need to do is these don't need to be done in a dichotomous way. The choice is not develop and fix these problems at the expense of biodiversity. It is, we can find smart solutions that maximize biodiversity conservation while still meeting goals. However, that requires information. Current problems are we're losing natural communities faster than we can map and direct conservation resources to them. These kind of large scale problems that we're trying to solve in land planning and resource management, as well as other emerging issues that has created a need for large in scope and large in spatial scale regional planning assessments. However, botanical data tend to be underrepresented in the data sets when these assessments are being conducted and the plans are being created. Large portions of our recorded data are not available digitally or in diffuse locations and not easily accessible. Furthermore, a lot of what gets considered in environmental review are just the rare species and unique habitats in areas of very high native biodiversity that maybe don't have the rare plant populations but are still significant for conservation, are not being jurisdictionally considered. So what's being done about all of this? I'm going to kind of go global to local. So some of you may be familiar with the Convention on Biological Diversity. It was adopted in 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit in Brazil. This is where a lot of the global environmental treaties came from, including the climate change treaty that generated the formation of the IPCC that generates those reports that are pretty disturbing to read every year. But also this convention to preserve the world's biodiversity. It was recognized that biodiversity declines were going to cause existential threat to humanity, and every country in the world signed on to it, with the exception of the United States and the Vatican, unfortunately. Technically, Bill Clinton did sign it, but it was not ratified by Congress. So we are not a party to this convention. This does present some opportunities, like counterintuitively, however, that I'll get to in a minute. What came out of this, though, is they have these meetings called the Conference of the Parties. And during the 5th Conference of the Parties in 2000, they generated a plan specific for plants called the Global Strategy for Plant Conservation. This target called for the protection of at first 50% and then updated in 2010, 75% of the most important areas for plant diversity in each ecological region by 2020. I think no one will be surprised that this target was not met. But it did beg the question, what is an important plant area? Plant Life International formed much in the same kind of framework as BirdLife International and their set of criteria for important bird areas that they use to disperse and have national sponsors for around the world. Audubon being that sponsor in California in the United States. Plant Life International has been doing that with important plant areas. They have this technical checklist with three overarching criteria with subcategories underneath each of these, but largely we're talking about criterion A is talking about rare species. Criterion B is talking about rich floral diversity in the context of its biogeographic zone. And criterion C is outstanding examples of habitat or vegetation type of regional plant conservation or botanical importance. So you can think of that as like rare vegetation types. What's being done in the United States, as early as the 1960s, we recognized there were environmental problems that needed to be addressed, leading into a lot of the environmental laws that were kind of came into being in the early 70s. Such as the Endangered Species Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, and state level assessments of important plant areas, which are more recent. You can find iterations of an important plant area document for the state of Colorado, state of Florida, state of Montana, state of New Mexico, and now California. California is looking a little different, in particular because it's not sponsored by a government entity, where CNPS is doing this as an NGO. And we've taken a much more technical approach than some of these other examples are. But this is just to illustrate there are a lot of interest in doing these kind of biodiversity assessments for plants. In California specifically, we have the California Endangered Species Act, the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA. Some of you may have heard. And then in 2018, we had the Governor Brown's executive order calling for implementation of the California Biodiversity Initiative, a section of which directly called for the identification, mapping, and protection of important plant areas. More recently, CNRA and the Newsom administration has signed executive orders that are supported by legislative bills calling for 30 by 30. And what this is conserving 30% of land and sea of the state for nature for the purpose of biodiversity conservation. There's a document out called Pathways to 30 by 30 that is available on the CNRA website. It's worth a read. It really outlines California's strategy to get to 30 by 30. And I'm really sticking on this because it is significant. 30 by 30 is a global effort that has tiered off from E.O. Wilson's Half Earth push. And so the idea there is his models have shown that we need to conserve 50% of land and sea across the planet to save 80% of the global biodiversity. And 30 by 30 kind of tiered off of that as a catchy goal of like, let's get 30% by 2030. California is the only government on earth with a plan to do it. So that's why this is particularly significant. And then I would be remiss in not mentioning the California Seed Rescue Project. Some of you may have seen that seed collection is not meeting the demands for restoration. And so things like California Seed Rescue Project that are trying to bank seeds of rare species to guard against extinction events are especially important. So thinking globally and acting locally, we were privileged to be part and help organize the California Extended Delegation to the Convention of Biodiversity Conference, 15th Conference of the Parties this last December in Montreal, Quebec. Among participants were members of the CNRA, including Secretary Wade Crowfoot, senators and assembly members from the state legislature, and numerous different nonprofits, the leaders of which included Rosalind Helfand and her neighborhood sustainability council group, Turtle Island Restoration Network, California Environmental Voters, and us CNPS. Here you see kind of a portion of the extended delegation pictured among with government officials from Canada and regional officials with Quebec. However, the full delegation was more than 40 people. It was pretty amazing. what did we accomplish by going there? The whole purpose was to hold up things like our 30 by 30 plan and increase ambition among the participants to the COP. This particular conference of the parties was significant in that they were negotiating a global agreement for conservation called the Global Biodiversity Framework. This is outlining all the countries of the world's commitments to save biodiversity and what they're going to accomplish by 2030. As goes with a lot of these negotiations, it tends to be a race to the bottom. And so California showed up as a subnational government holding up what we have achieved here as an environmental leader, saying that this is possible and we should not be racing to the bottom. We weren't the only ones there that were going through with that strategy. An organization called ICLEI, which is a global network of subnational governments, ranging from municipalities to counties to provinces, et cetera, at a biodiversity summit during the Conference of the Parties. And through this and various side events, there were a lot of outcomes, including information sharing, things that we learned from other international partners, information we were able to share, and numerous agreements that the state entered in with governments of Scotland and Quebec on conserving and sharing resources for saving biodiversity. It was pretty incredible. There's a lot of energy coming out of this. And so it will be a very interesting year, I think, to watch the legislature as well as the executive administration to see where they go with all this excitement that was generated in Montreal. I will also say these side events are kind of things that are happening outside of the formal negotiations. And we were able to finally meet in person our collaborators, Plant Life International, based in the United Kingdom. So that was really exciting to kind of go participate in their side event, talk about what we're doing with important plant areas and compare to like how they've done important plant areas, and get to meet some of the folks who are now with IUCN, but actually wrote the document that I'm referencing that kind of described initially what important plant areas are. So all that being said, we have this global context and we went and participated on the global stage. Now we have to bring it back home. As I said, IPAs can serve as a solution to these existing regional assessment issues, and that we have a centralization of existing data. We've already done the mining and done the analysis, and it's a lot easier to digest when it's all in a single place. Furthermore, we tried to fill in the gaps by digitizing expert information in regional workshops that some of you might have participated in. From 2018 through fall of 2022, we held regional workshops that, because of COVID, transitioned to webinars that were remotely broadcast. And we engaged with more than 500 regional stakeholders and experts providing information and critiquing our model and data. Through this, we highlighted survey needs for data poor areas. We have found a few issues with the way we've done this analysis, so I'm in the process of reconstructing this data gaps assessment, but that will be ready by end of June. Finally, this is meant to be a transparent and collaborative process to facilitate adoption by policymakers, regulators, land managers, conservation advocates, essentially all of you that are here listening to me tonight. It's not necessarily a new idea. It's kind of a combination of multiple strategies that have been done in the past. We're doing the grassroots engagement through our regional workshops with big data analysis. We have, I think, 4 terabytes of data at this point that we've processed and gone through over the last 4+ years, and have sought to make this like, it doesn't really mean as much if I'm doing it by myself or Kendall, our program coordinator, is doing it by theirself. It really is coming from everybody that has participated in this process. It's very much crowdsourced. And it has been adapted and reconstructed based on end user and expert feedback. What is helping with this is that the assessments are relative in nature. meaning locations are assessed within an ecoregion. So when we're comparing biodiversity hotspots of the Central Coast USDA ecoregion, for instance, we're comparing them against each other. We're not necessarily saying the Central Coast is more important than the Mojave Desert, because what's valuable in the Central Coast for biodiversity is not the same as what's important in the desert for conserving biodiversity. So ultimately, we are seeking to protect the value of our native plant species, offer ecologically, aesthetically, and culturally, and identify the most important areas for saving our unique biodiversity. This is just a quick timeline. I think it is interesting to look at because we have what's happening on the global stage with Plant Life International and the Convention on Biodiversity. Independent of that, in 2006, the CNPS East Bay chapter had developed botanical priority preservation areas, which was kind of the impetus for CNPS getting involved in this effort. And really the global and local didn't really come together until we started looking in 2018, and we formally adopted an important plant areas program at CNPS at the state level, looking to unite what we could do with groundwork chapters had already done with frameworks that already existed globally. So those three criteria categories I had shown earlier, the rare plants, unique biodiversity, and rare vegetation and habitat types, is how we categorize our data such that we can have this big data analysis that's reviewed by a large number of stakeholders and regional experts, but that will also meet the criteria for identifying international important plant areas. So the specifics on how we put this together are, we went through a data gathering and data mining phase where we went to our partners at California Department of Fish and Wildlife and every other corner of the internet we could find and mined and downloaded as much data as we could find. Then we organized expert workshops region by region to review the data and contribute additional data sets. We went through a series of iterative models based on this information we got from the initial workshops, and then had those same workshop participants review our model outcomes and give us feedback on what we got right and what needed to be changed. So this kind of like steps 3 through 5 were kind of done over and over and over and over and over again up until last October. So this is what our workshops look like. Depending on internet connectivity and whether or not we were doing it in person, we had a combination of hard copy maps that folks could download or draw their field experience onto, or ArcGIS Online data collection application where we could display information that we had and have folks kind of input in their own spatial data from field notebooks, old GPS logs, et cetera. This was then put into, again, we've got our rare species, our botanically significant areas, and our rare vegetation habitat features, same as the Plant Life International criteria. We had initially really focused in on tribal engagement and trying to represent tribal conservation priorities. What we kind of found is that tribes really wanted a lot more engagement and relationship building from CNPS as a whole. So as kind of a sidebar, this has generated a lot of work through our Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, Justice Committee and the Indigenous Engagement Working Group on how to address that. Because we had by and large gotten feedback that tribes were interested, but they wanted to make sure that they retained the sovereignty over their data. We are still working on the best way to ethically set up those data sovereignty agreements and have removed that segment from the initial go at important plant areas. As we build those relationships, we will be adding it back in moving forward. So where are we now? This is probably what everyone's wondering from those that attended the 2019 presentation where we were only talking about the Central Valley. here are our important plant areas of California. This is our final map that is available on our website. Please go have a look at the IPA website and email me if you have any issues with it. I will say just take some patience with it. There's a lot of information on it. And because of some foibles with ESRI and their servers, it can load somewhat slowly. So if you just kind of scroll through it at a leisurely pace, it'll work a lot better. But what we found is, and this is not the entirety of what you're seeing, just within the state limits, there's more than 20 million acres of important plant areas mapped. Of these, 5 million acres fall within the 30 by 30 pathways document definition of conserved. Meaning we've got roughly 15 million acres of conservation opportunities. This is huge. To achieve 30 by 30, the state has set a goal of getting an additional 6 million acres in just the next 7 years into conservation status. If we just focused on IP, obviously there's going to be other considerations because they're talking about biodiversity as a whole, not just plants. But if we are focusing on IPAs, we have opportunities that are 2.5 times greater than this goal. So there's a lot to choose from. While some might see this as a really good opportunity and there's a lot that could be done here, some can kind of just be overwhelmed at the sheer volume of what we're looking at here. So just to kind of look at conserved versus not conserved, this is kind of a way to visualize it. But there are other ideas we've kind of been going through on how to further refine this analysis to narrow in on our top priorities for conservation in California. So that being said, in the back of your mind, how would we use this map? Even if we do refine it, whether or not you refine it, we've got our advocacy use. And I think this is perhaps the most powerful use of important plant areas, is that it's proactive and forward thinking. It's easier to protect an area before millions of dollars have been invested on developing it. At that point, you're kind of fighting financial interests and potentially going into litigation. It's expensive, it's slow, and you're not generally saving that many acres at a time doing it that way. It's not to say that that's not an important advocacy tool, because it is, but we might get more bang for our buck if we get there before the developers do. And that's what this is an attempt to look at in a map. Furthermore, it can be used as a collaborative tool for development projects to meet housing, energy, and food needs. In that, if we can site projects outside of important plant areas and get strong mitigation for those projects within the important plant areas, we can kind of get the most bang for a conservation dollar, as well as making sure that we kind of have these smart projects that aren't enabling sprawl and unnecessarily impacting our state's biodiversity. Furthermore, for land trusts and large conservation landowners, parcels within IPAs can be highlighted for conservation acquisition and easement. For certification of a land trust, this can be important as part of the scientifically driven strategy, or it can just be another way to market to donors that's like, this is a really important area and we got to fundraise to like get this under conservation. And as I said, with planning, again, directing impactful land use changes away from important plant areas is kind of the hope here. And there are a lot of threats. This is coming from our website. We have a whole section on threats to IPAs, and you can go and play around with it. These are urban build-out model by 2030 for kind of the Central California region. Areas that are more red are under a higher risk as indicated by the model for development by 2030, and areas that are less red are under a lower risk. And we've got that for 2030, 2050, and 2100. Climate change. No part of California is going to be untouched by climate change. And there might be hard conversations to be had for the areas that are going to be most exposed to climate change, those very red areas. The reddest areas and the areas that have no color at all, are going to experience extreme changes in the next before 2100. I think this is by 2085 is what this forecast is looking at. And so it might be that we look at our climate resilient areas in the North Coast and the Sierra Nevada and some of these other areas for really making sure we protect those climate refugia and increase connectivity between our protected areas so that things can move as the climate changes. Extreme wildfire. Wildfire is a natural part of California ecosystems, but the changes to those fire regimes can throw off the balance of that system. For example, a lot of chaparral communities burn catastrophically. That's just how they are. That's their ecology. But they do so at very particular intervals that the species that grow within those environments are adapted to. You might have seeds that can live a certain number of years in the seed bank and require fire to sprout. And so that fire interval is very important for maintaining those populations, as well as recruitment for standing species and dominant species, such as many manzanitas. Right in the East Bay, we've got pallid manzanita that needs fire to sprout, but obviously fire is pretty risky in the East Bay Hills. Like I'm sure a lot of people remember the Oakland Hills fire. So changes to those regimes, if fire becomes too frequent, you can eliminate recruitment because the plants don't have enough time to mature and set seed, especially our shrubs. But if it's too infrequent, we might lose out on some of those seeds in the seed bank. So it's kind of finding that balance of what's adapted to. Finally, well, not finally, but something I think folks don't think a lot about is fertilizer coming from the air directly as a result of tailpipe emissions. Nitrogen oxides, or NOx, NOx and SOx, some of you might be familiar with the terminology, are outputs from internal combustion engines. And what is happening that is pretty concerning is the deposition of that nitrogen is kind of acting as fertilizer. And what is happening is it's enabling non-native species to get stronger footholds in habitats they wouldn't normally exist in. So for instance, a lot of our serpentine endemics exist because of the chemistry of that soil. And it's in and of itself toxic to a lot of the Mediterranean annual grasses, for instance. However, you add enough nitrogen to it, all of a sudden those grasses can get a foothold in those habitats. So this is pretty significant and worth considering. Sea level rise. All of our coastal areas are going to be impacted to some degree by sea level rise. I think we're zoomed in here on the Bay because the biggest impacts are likely to be in the Delta region. And this is something we're going to have to account for, whether it be through increasing wetland elevation, managed retreat to allow for upland migration as sea levels rise. There's a variety of tools we can use, but we need to be aware of it and planning for it when we're thinking about conservation. And then I alluded to this previously, but invasive species. So this is from the CalIPSI weed mapper data. Representing species richness of number of CalIPSI listed species per USGS quadrangle. And you see the highest densities are where the biggest populations are. Not of any surprise, because that's where we're importing things from other parts of the world. It's where most travel is happening. There's a lot of reasons for that. Regional conservation implementation, therefore, should consider all of these threats. So I had talked about refining that 15 million acres of opportunity, which was this map. We can look at it, for instance, by development risk. So we have our areas that are already conserved, and then areas that are most likely versus least likely to be developed by 2030, and really zeroing in on those locations. These are primarily going to be along and bordering our urban areas. And so urban biodiversity is critical to this effort, especially when we're talking about sprawl. But also the location of projects and making sure that we're doing smart development. We need housing. We should probably be doing infill instead of greenfield building. We can further refine this and look at how we can get co-benefits. There's a large equity and access to nature component for the 30 by 30 plan for California. And so we can look at the California Air Resources Board disadvantaged community maps and California tribal lands and look at where are the important plant areas that are going to be really maximize the conservation of biodiversity and access to nature in those communities that are also under the highest risk of urban development threat. And that's what's shown in blue in this map. So there's a lot of ways we can really zero in on these and use them for regional planning. Next steps. As you may be wondering, there is a scale to this. Our reporting units are 1 square kilometer. And there is a data gaps analysis I alluded to earlier as well. So we are working on that data gaps analysis. That includes, instead of just taking raw density of data, categorizing the data by what is collected in the field, what is indicator data, and what is model data, and representing that in our identified important plant areas. We might have an area that's coming out really hot for plant conservation value, but doesn't necessarily have a lot of field data associated with it. So we'd want to highlight that for some ground truthing and on-the-ground surveys as opportunities for that arise. Other areas we're working on is, if you've seen our website, it's pretty much a static scroll through story map. You can kind of explore the maps and zoom around in them, and it's interactive in that sense, but it doesn't give you as much underlying information as went into developing all those data sets. And so what we would like to do is generate a more interactive reporting mechanism that can tell you what species are present in that IPA and why that IPA is important. So that's something we're looking at for next steps. Also, increasing our engagement with tribes and developing those tribal sovereignty agreements is kind of in the future. I would say most what's coming in the next couple of months is going to be all of our metadata and documentation we're working on right now. It's not super exciting, but it's necessary. And then a number of reports that we'll be submitting to the Wildlife Conservation Board, who has provided a large amount of funding to get us over the finish line. And that will include kind of a scientific paper we'll be submitting to some journals, a larger documentation paper of what data went into the model and how we processed it, and then a document describing how we can keep the model updated. This is meant to be a living data set, and it's not a snapshot in time. We'll be periodically incorporating new information as it becomes available, and then also trying to track how IPAs are being conserved over time. Another conversation we've been having, and I'll be interested to see where this goes, is some of you may have heard talk of what's called key biodiversity areas. And I really think that's kind of where a lot of conservation is going, is seeing where important plant areas intersect with important bird areas, or important plant areas are also important for lots of wildlife species as well. So we have been speaking with IUCN to talk about potential collaboration there. So there's a lot of opportunity, and it will be an exciting next couple of months. With that, thank you very much. Go to cnps.org/IPA. The actual web address is longer than that, but that'll redirect you to our webpage, and it's short, easy to remember. So that's why that's the one I use. And feel free to email me at syoung@cnps.org. With that, I'll turn to the chat and any questions that folks might have.
Hey, Sam, there are a couple people with their hands raised. Can I allow them to speak?
Yeah, sure.
Sure. Susan Warden, are you out there? Are you available? I'm gonna click on so that you can speak if you're available.
Oh, I'm sorry. I really didn't have a question, but it was very exciting. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. No
very
problem.
exciting.
Thanks. Glad you enjoyed it. There was someone else too, but I think maybe they put their hand down. But
we'll go back into the chat. Lots of links. Thanks, Noreen.
Mhm.
Yeah, surprisingly few questions so far, but I've got a question for you.
Sure.
If you don't mind. That's an incredible amount of data. And I'm just, you know, kind of mind blown about, okay, how many people have been working on this? And can you speak a little bit about the data gathering? Because it seems like it must have been hundreds of people out there for years to get.
Yeah. Surprisingly, the data man. So this is not. I do have to just really give a lot of thanks and shout out to everyone who participated in our workshops and webinars. Like I said, there were like just over 500 people we engaged with over the last 4 years. It was incredible with all that input and feedback we got. That being said, for the first probably 2 years, it was just me. And then when we got the WCB funding, I was able to hire Kendall King, our program coordinator, who's been an invaluable member of our team and has been working hard on making sure our data catalog is up to date the last month. So since early 2020, there have been just 2 of us.
So have you been using any like robotics or anything like that, or how? Or is it mostly just visual observation and notation?
So a lot of the processing we do just using Esri products and ArcGIS, and we're able to do that process large amounts of data pretty quickly with the processing tools they have in that software. However, some of the data sets are so large it crashes ArcGIS, so we had to find alternative solutions. And I always kind of joke about this, like living in the Bay Area, it's like such a tech economy. And I was never a tech person. I was like an outside person. I worked for the Forest Service. I was always dirty. And here I am learning how to program so I can process this data. So I've learned Python and we've been writing Python scripts to do some of this.
So there's a question from Nina Moore. Curious about your opinion about the huge human turnout and its impact on the land during super blooms. Does that help or hurt ecological awareness?
Yeah, it's hard because on the one hand, it is very damaging when people walk into wildflower fields and trample everything before they're able to set seed. But at the same time, I always like want to, I appreciate that there's so much appreciation for nature. Like there's so much excitement about it. And I just think that there's an opportunity to really engage with that community to get them involved in the conservation field. They like their Instagram photos and they want to take that and get their followers or whatever. But with those influencers, like, I don't know. I think there's probably an opportunity to engage them and get them to like raise awareness among their viewers.
Cool. Let's see. Someone has suggested, can't we make links with tech folks to support this? I'm not sure exactly what they're referring to.
Yeah, that's something we are discussing, is contracting a full stack programmer to help with the reporting mechanism that's on our wish list that I described. But that's something we're still negotiating and looking at if we have funding for it.
And Robin's mentioning how in Carrizo in 2019, she was impressed with how respectful visitors were relative to the plants. We were there too. That was wonderful.
I love Carrizo. It's one of my favorite spots.
Yeah, so that sort of leads into something we've been reminiscing about here. We're Noreen and I and most of our board, of course, are involved in a lot of local conservation issues. And of course, when we see the maps, we're like, oh, we're in the red zone. Oh, we're in the red zone again. You know, however, San Francisco, the peninsula, I mean, in its natural state, you know, prior to 1776, or it was, you know, would have like been like an incredible national park and super high biodiverse area. And And of course, for lots of reasons, that most of it is covered now. We still have 32% of vegetated land here. And, one of our crazy goals is to try and, take it back into a much more biodiverse state. And so one of our concerns, and I was just meeting with the Sierra Club and some ABAG folks earlier today about their priority conservation areas. And we've regularly kind of been worried that, when you prioritize one area, you sort of de facto deprioritize another area, because it's like, okay, and we get the bang for the buck thing, but sometimes you feel like, oh gosh, we're kind of like the sacrifice zone here, And
Yeah.
we're wondering about, is there some kind of effort to balance that out, especially since if you had greater visual representation and biodiversity where people live, they would could connect better with their natural heritage and not have to travel all the way down to the Antelope Hills.
Yeah, definitely. So what I'll say is I think that that it's always the hard thing with prioritization is like you have to pick what the top thing that we need to focus on is, because unfortunately if we focus on everything we won't get anywhere, and it's just not really a good way forward. That being said, I don't necessarily want to I don't think about it as deprioritizing other areas. I don't necessarily think that it de facto does that. I think I like to think of it as it's an affirmative analysis. It's not a negative analysis. So, for example, we've got our important plant areas. We know that within the landscape, those spots are particularly important for conserving plant biodiversity. That's not to say areas outside of it aren't also important, but based on what we know right now, that these areas are particularly important. So what we're trying to do is not provide a shortcut or override any sort of like necessary due diligence, like the environmental review and whatever that needs to be done regardless of if you're in an IPA or not. Because there are sensitive resources that are outside of those areas. And we might just not know about them. Like an area might not be an IPA because we just don't have information. And that's what the data gaps analysis tells us. And those are opportunities to do more surveys. It's challenging because a lot of those areas are either incredibly hard to get to because they're in extremely rugged terrain and very remote, or they're on private land and we don't have access. So what I would say is when it comes to prioritization and when we're working on a really short timeline, like the next 7 years, IPAs are a good starting point, but they're not the finish line. And it's not to say let's develop or write off everything that's not an IPA. It's just like, if we want the most bang for our buck, let's focus here first.
Yeah, understood. But you can see the conundrum.
For sure. I get that question a lot.
And we're the most densely populated of all of the chapters, I think, for our territory. So we're up against a lot of we feel like, oh my gosh, we're being swamped. As many thousands of plants as we put out there, we're being swamped by the commercial landscape industry every day. So anyway,
so
there's a question.
I see Robin's question, and I just wanted to address it. I by no means am a horticulture person, but I do know that our horticulture program works on things like that. And native plants in city environments does improve native biodiversity. It provides habitat for pollinators and whatnot. So it really can be a solution for folks in cities to contribute to conserving biodiversity. Like everybody can do this. And what's neat is you get enough people doing it, is there's kind of for those that really want to get in the weeds and read the island biogeography book, it kind of applies to urban environments too. Is you got these little patches of habitat that are essentially islands, and you get enough of them and they get close enough together, all of a sudden it enables movement of species between those habitats, and it creates connectivity and permeability in the city, which is something I'm super interested in researching more personally.
Yeah, we're actually have several programs going on here in San Francisco trying to reestablish biodiversity corridors and bring back some of the species that rely on that movement. So it's a interesting situation we've got going here. So.
Yeah.
Someone's asking about the island book. Do you know the?
Yeah, it's called it's a technical ecological text called The Theory of Island Biogeography. It was written by E.O. Wilson, and a grad school professor would kill me for not remembering the other guy. But I have it on my shelf. I can go find it.
Are there opportunities for members to support legislative action or other efforts at the state level?
Yeah, our conservation team is always looking for support. So I would just look out for kind of the email blast from the state office for calls to action. I think there are a number of really neat bills that are coming out because there was so much excitement coming out of everyone who went to COP15 with us in Montreal. So I think there will be a lot of interesting legislation. I did see there was a non-proliferation of fossil fuels bill being circulated that I'll be interested to see where that goes, but it's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Nice.
No, it's cool that you got to go. Peter Brastow, who is one of our board members and also works for San Francisco Environment, got to go too. And he just shared a report at a meeting last week. Very exciting.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, it was a lot of fun seeing Peter there.
Yeah, right on. Well, hey, this is really inspiring work. I'm sorry to throw the hardball urban question at you there.
No, it's great. All questions are valid, and if anyone has more or just needs to digest this more and wants to come back with more questions later or wants a more detailed walkthrough, please email us and we're happy to schedule something.
And Jason just did throw a last minute question in there. Thoughts about putting dollar valuation on plant biodiversity? Is that?
Oh yeah. That would be a question for the natural capital group at Stanford. But it would be interesting to team up with them and see if we could like stick IPAs into their valuation model.
Invaluable though. And that was really fun. It was really great hearing what you're up to, Sam, and inspiring work, man. Keep on it. We appreciate it.
All right, thank you.
All right, and we'll look forward to seeing everybody. I hope that's here next month, and we'll be seeing Sam out in the field soon. I hope.
All right.
Good night, everybody. Thanks, Sam.
Thank you, everyone.